Starting with the very first Silent Hill game, I fell balls deep in love with horror games. Every single thing about them. Ridiculously esoteric puzzles, intricate environments, incredible monster designs, inventory management, and even janky-ass combat. But then came the Dark Ages. Konami gave Silent Hill to people who've never played a Silent Hill game, and Resident Evil sunk deeper into cover shooter mediocrity, piggybacking off of 4's more action-focused combat while being completely tone-deaf to what made 4 so good. Just when I had let go of hope for the genre, a company called Frictional Games came and said, "Don't worry, baby, I got you." In 2010, Amnesia: The Dark Descent was released on PC, and I was treated to a game that made me shit my pants more times than I can count, and I fucking loved it. This game, coupled with the rise of YouTube, helped a lot with giving the genre a much-needed first aid spray, and in the coming years we would see an onslaught of horror releases once again, but I can't help but feel something had been lost. Amnesia really had most of my boxes checked. It had creative puzzles, from mixing different chemicals to a variety of physics-based fare, a solid inventory system for tinderboxes, health draughts, puzzle items, etc., and a massive mansion which descended into a twisted eldritch torture castle. But one thing it lacked was a means to defend yourself against the threats, and thus would be the trend for every single horror game after. First issue with modern horror trends: lack of mechanical variety. Many people have argued that this helps keep the tension, and if you could defend yourself, then it makes the overall experience much less frightening. This is something I wholeheartedly disagree with, and here's why. Tell me if this sounds familiar. First, you're playing one of those spoopy run-from-the-baddie games, and the first hour is tense as fuck. You're not sure when or where the baddies are gonna start coming for your ass, but you know at some point a skeleton is gonna pop out of that closet and try to add you to their sock puppet collection. Next, the baddie has revealed itself, and with the addition of a new obstacle, the tension is up and it changes the way you've played up until this point. Now, in addition to other various objectives, you're trying to avoid the spoopy boy. This is where the games peak, in my opinion. Finally, we hit the good old diminishing returns. You've been playing this for a while now, and the monsters have maybe gotten a little more frequent and the difficulty is likely spiked. But the actual fear you experience has more or less plummeted. Now they're just inconveniences. As you have no real way of dealing with them other than hiding and running, what was once frightening has become little more than a roadblock to the game's progression. This is in stark contrast to, say, Silent Hill or Resident Evil. Now, Silent Hill 2 has had its jimmies fondled by every critic I can think of, and I'm going to add a hand to that pile. Silent Hill 2 found the perfect middle ground. The game's atmosphere was incredible, and the monsters offered a pretty hefty challenge, many of them soaking up valuable resources and being more than capable of killing you in just 2 to 3 hits. Shit was scary, but it was scary in a different way. In addition to standard spoops, it placed the heavy burden of choice on the player. With multiple avenues to solve a confrontation and finite resources, each encounter is renewing your engagement, so you are not fatigued or frustrated by repetitive mechanics. Further beyond that, there were monsters that your weapons did absolutely nothing against. Take, for instance, either one of the Pyramid Head fights. You've gotten used to being able to defeat the monsters you've encountered so far, but suddenly you are once again the hunted, as bullets and melee weapons simply bounce off of Pyramid Head's big old pyramid head. Instead, the game is requiring you to go back to your survival roots before you found those powerful weapons. Second issue, some shit don't make no sense. Another hunk of beef I've had with this particular movement are the enemies themselves. Amnesia, once again, did a pretty good job of this. The enemies in that game were previous workers and subjects of the extra-dimensional being Alexander, who had morphed them into hulking eldritch monstrosities. An imposing enemy, to be sure. My issue comes into play when it's things like Outlast. Outlast just had you going up against people. Mostly physically normal people, for that matter, depicting as having a mental illness, which is a horror trope I really wish would stop in general. It's definitely not some insurmountable force or eldritch beast. It's just a dude, or sometimes a pair of really hung naked dudes. Similarly, the sequel has you going up against hillbillies, essentially. I grew up in a small town filled with hillbillies. I can attest that they can be defeated pretty easily by physical trauma and liberal views. I can't help but feel it really breaks me away from the immersion and the fear when I should be on equal footing with the foe in question. Slender and similar cryptids, I feel, have this issue as well, just in a different way. What makes Slender Man terrifying is shit like when you've been watching a Marble Hornets episode for 11 minutes, only to realize Slender Man's been expertly placed and subtly framed in the shot you've been watching for the entire time. He is not as scary when he's directly pursuing you after you found an embarrassing entry from his edgy middle school journal. Third issue, stop over-explaining. Storytelling in these games, I feel, has also taken a bit of a back seat to cheap scares. By and large, a lot of modern horror is guilty of my least favorite expositional sin, having to read a modest paperback in order to get any plot points. Running through a dangerous landscape with death peeking around every corner, only to have to stop and read an 8-page document for 15 minutes, highlighting new information to further the plot. Beyond that, by the end of the game, if you've taken the time to find each and every document, typically you will know everything and you're left with little to no questions. At face value, this seems great. But losing the mystery, you also lose a little bit of the fear as well as any potential for discussion. This is where I will shit on Silent Hill a bit, because after Silent Hill 4 it absolutely fell into the narrative pitfall of trying to explain the town and why fucked up things happen there, when not knowing was an integral part of the experience. I appreciate it when a game is willing to let me live in the mystery. There is a sweet spot, to be sure, where just enough is explained to allow you to understand your journey, but also just enough is omitted to where you're thinking about this long after the game is completed. This does a great job at building communities around certain titles. I mean, look at Five Nights at Freddy's. While I'm not a big fan of this series personally, one thing I can certainly appreciate about them is the storytelling. The game's only direct means of storytelling are through a daily call you receive at the beginning of each shift. But if you actually spend time hunting around, there are clues and secrets hinting at a much deeper plot that never gets fully explicitly explained. And I mean, we all know the community that FNAF has, for fuck's sake. There's what, like 10 game theories on the damn thing. Point being, by not explaining everything, you've allowed people to be captivated by your product. I also appreciate it when a game takes the time to offer multiple avenues of explaining their world and the unfortunate circumstances your characters come to be involved in. One of my favorite modern survival horror games is Bloodborne for this very reason. Now I know you may be thinking, but Derek, that is a Souls game. I would argue that Bloodborne is the closest callback to survival horror games of old that's been made in a really long time. Everything in the game's design is geared to immerse you in that world. Item descriptions and flavor text, item functions, creature design, weapons, gameplay, etc. It always explains enough to keep you gripped, but leaves out enough to allow your imagination to take over. All that being said, I feel like this movement of horror games was ultimately important. It did bring life back to an otherwise dead genre with the help of the YouTube community, and I think it has given some perspective back to AAA developers. We wouldn't have something like PT had it not been for this revival, and while its game Silent Hills did not take flight, PT is still a very compelling experience in and of itself. Furthermore, take a look at the newest Resident Evil. Resi 7 has all the boxes checked for a first-person fright fest akin to Outlast. But in addition to this is a robust combat system that allows you to have some agency over encounters. And it's the most I've been invested in a horror game in a very long time. It is honestly one of my favorite entries in the series. And it wears the influences from Outlast and Amnesia on its sleeve. Now I just need to wait for Kojima and Del Toro to make like Quiet Knoll, or Hushed Mound, or Uncommunicative Mountain. Fuck, I don't know. Give me more Silent Hill from someone who actually knows what the fuck they're doing. The more I did this, the more I just didn't like Outlast.
The more you did the script, the more you're like, man, Outlast was not that good.
Outlast was not very good.